Everybody, glad you can be with us for the latest lecture in our series marking the marking Northern Ireland 100. Not actually, as you'll have noticed from Reclaim's agreed statement on this subject, not actually something we have viewed with any great enthusiasm. But we have felt that we needed to respond to the anniversary. And of course, I think one of our perspectives is that, you know, in many ways, partition was a disaster for the North, but we can't escape the fact that the tale was not much better for the south of Ireland, and in many ways, you know, if we're talking about the Enlightenment, I mean, our 18th century predecessors could not have contemplated the partition of the island or the nature of the two states that would emerge. And I'm very glad that we've got Fergus Whelan with us tonight to describe for us the what actually happened south of the new border, especially after the Free Staters won the Civil War that took place in the south, and set about creating their own new little state. Fergus comes very well equipped. His most recent book was a biography of William Drennan, May Tyrants Tremble. He's also written a biography of Archibald Hamilton Rowan, the God-provoking Democrat, and also a book on the dissenting origins, or the radical dissenting origins of Presbyterianism, in particular in Dublin, but as it later migrated north. So he's very well equipped with our background, but as during his working life, an active trade unionist and involved in many causes in the Republic, he's also very well equipped to look at what happened down there, as we say, up here. So you're very welcome, Fergus. And I should say that we're very glad to have Fergus on board as a member of the Committee of Reclaim the Enlightenment. Over to you, Fergus.
Thank you very much, John. I'm starting at the end of the Civil War, basically. And I've called this paper When the Poor Felt the Lash of the Liberator, and I think you'll understand why in a few minutes. The vicious way the Irish Civil War was fought by both sides ensured that its aftermath was marked not by mere animosity, but rather with a visceral hatred between the protagonists. When the formal hostilities ended, the defeated IRA could rise only to defiant violent posturing, while the victors thought of little but repression and restoring law and order. The IRA's posturing included jailbreaks, prison hunger strikes, and ongoing sporadic violence in the country at large. Minister for Home Affairs, later Justice Kevin O'Higgins, was given the primary responsibility for the restoration of law and order in the wake of the Civil War. In April 1925, he introduced his Treasonable Offences Bill, making it an offence to levy war against the state. 2 months later, two senior IRA members, Sean Russell and Jerry Boland, visited the Soviet Union. Russell's purpose in going was to seek Soviet military help. Jerry Boland's purpose in going was to watch Russell and report back to de Valera, because although de Valera was nominally president of Sinn Féin at the time and very close to the IRA, it was coming close to the time when those two bodies were going to, that de Valera was going to depart from those two bodies. So Boland went to Russia basically to watch to see what Russell was up to and report back to Dev. When the Civil War came to an end, the anti-treaty side seemed to have very little to offer the people of the new state, other than apparently pointless, ongoing, sporadic violence in pursuit of their mythical republic. During a by-election in March 1925, the pro-government newspaper, the Irish Independent, pointed this out, and I quote, "When Mr. de Valera and his followers were asked by the unemployed what their plans were for providing work, or by the slum dwellers what their plans were for providing houses, they could only reply, wait until the Republic is established." Nor did the government have much to offer the unemployed or the slum dwellers either. The economic well-being of the people counted for little. Determined to balance the books, they cut social welfare payments, they cut the blind pension, the old age pension. Professor Joe Lee was not overstating the case when he declared that the founders of the Free State waged a coherent campaign against the weaker elements in the community, and that the poor, the aged, the unemployed all felt the lash of the Liberator. High levels of unemployment, emigration, urban slums, and rural poverty were given no priority. The successive secretaries to the Department of Finance, Joe Brennan and Jojo McElligott, were just the sort of arch-conservatives that the Cosgrave regime needed. Both men nurtured an aversion of the working class in general and organised labour in particular. They were bent on reducing wages and salaries, and they rendered sterling service in their retrenchment programme. Sean Murray, the future leader of the Irish Communist Party, would later put it this way: the Cosgrave government, the Southern capitalists, smashed down the standards of all social services, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, reduced salaries and wages in public services, rationalised industry on the railways and in the factories by getting more work done by less workers, reducing wages in every industry and occupation. Women's rights, particularly the rights of working women, were targeted and systematically eroded by the Cosgrave regime. A Jesuit, Father Edward Cahill, wrote in 1924, and I quote, "In a Christian state, women should be excluded by law from occupying or becoming unbecoming or dangerous to, in a Christian state, women should be excluded even by law from occupations unbecoming or dangerous to female modesty. The employment of wives and mothers in factories or outside their own households should be strictly limited by legislation. Girls should not be employed away from their homes or in work other than domestic until they have reached a sufficiently mature age so that they should not be exposed too soon to external dangers to their modesty." In 1925, the rights of women to compete for jobs in the civil service was restricted. 2 years later, Kevin O'Higgins introduced legislation to exclude women from sitting on juries. And even later, when de Valera came to power in 1932, he did nothing to reverse this. In fact, he went further by compelling female teachers and civil servants to retire from their jobs on marriage. The electoral support for Sinn Féin held up remarkably well, despite its failure to put forward any social policy or engage in normal political activity of any kind. By March of 1925, de Valera led a party, now this is the Sinn Féin party, that had 48 TDs elected to the Dáil. All of them refused to take their seats. The Cumann na Gael government's main priority, as I said earlier, was to restore law and order. The self-imposed powerlessness of Sinn Féin TDs gave the government a free hand to introduce repressive legislation and to govern without an effective opposition. For example, O'Higgins' treason bill had been passed by 38 votes for, 21 votes against, in a House where there were 153 TDs entitled to vote. The bill would not have passed had de Valera's TDs taking their seats in the Dáil. This government had won the Civil War, but it wasn't popular, nor was it governing with a democratic mandate, other than that bestowed on it by the absence of the recalcitrant enemies from the Dáil chamber. Some of the anti-treaty side began to question the wisdom and sustainability of Sinn Féin abstentionism. At an IRA convention held in November in Dalkey, County Dublin in 1924, the Chief of Staff, Frank Aiken TD, might be worth repeating that, the Chief of Staff of the IRA, Frank Aiken TD, was deposed because when challenged, he admitted that he was in favour of ending abstentionism. When a vote to ignore the oath of allegiance and enter the Dáil was lost at the Sinn Féin Ardèche in March 1926, de Valera and his supporters left the party and set up Fianna Fáil the following May. Many senior members of the IRA followed de Valera into Fianna Fáil, including Frank Aiken, Sean Lamass, Sean McEntee, Jerry Boland, and of course Countess Markievicz. However, strong links were maintained between the two organisations, and Insean McCone, one historian, tells us that dual membership of both organisations, in other words, Fianna Fáil and the IRA, was encouraged until Fianna Fáil reached power in 1932. Efforts by the IRA to bring Fianna Fáil, the IRA and Sinn Féin to get into an alliance for the election of June 1927 failed mainly because Fianna Fáil weren't interested. Nonetheless, the results showed an appetite for change amongst the electorate. The three parties offering an alternative to the government, Fianna Fáil, Labour and Sinn Féin, won 73 seats between them. The government won only 47. In this, their first outing, Fianna Fáil secured 44 seats. However, when the newly elected Fianna Fáil deputies attempted to take their seats in the chamber, they were turned away because of their refusal to take the oath of allegiance to the Crown. De Valera mounted a legal challenge and began to collect 75,000 signatures of citizens seeking a referendum to abolish the oath of allegiance under Article 44 of the Constitution. Because of the surge in support for Fianna Fáil, de Valera was confident he could raise the necessary signatures and win the subsequent referendum. Or as Tim Pat Coogan has observed, voting to retain an oath to the British Crown was not exactly calculated to enthuse the public. In the event, de Valera did not have to bother with seeking a referendum. A momentous event which might have derailed his extraordinary progress rebounded to his political advantage. Three IRA men, two of whom, Bill Gannon and Archie Doyle, were Fianna Fáil supporters, and the third, Timothy Coughlin, an active member of Fianna Fáil. The three of these people assassinated Kevin O'Higgins, the Minister for Justice, as he walked to Mass in Booterstown on Sunday, the 12th of July, 1927. The killers were not identified until many years later. However, Timothy Coughlin, one of the killers, was himself shot dead when he tried to shoot a police agent the following year in 1928. So here we have a member of Fianna Fáil trying to shoot a police agent in 1928. He gets shot himself, and Fianna Fáil give him a massive funeral where Sean McEntee, TD, and very soon to be Cabinet Minister, made a fiery speech vowing that Fianna Fáil would avenge the would-be assassin. It is said that Kevin O'Higgins had a profoundly pessimistic view of human nature and of Irish human nature in particular. He saw his role in public life as waging a war against greed, envy, lust, drunkenness, and irresponsibility. He had once boasted that he and his colleagues were the most conservative revolutionaries ever to carry through a successful revolution. The new government certainly reflected this conservatism. The Catholic hierarchy had been strongly supportive of the Free State government during the war. Maurice Curtis suggests that this support was invaluable as the Catholic Church overwhelmingly controlled the minds and the hearts of the people through the education system. Coogan says that the bishop's death grip on Irish education and thought moulding processes ensured that they got the kind of legislator and legislation that they required in the new state. O'Higgins had studied for the priesthood at Maynooth College, but had been expelled for disciplinary and academic reasons. As a government minister, he was as anxious as the Catholic hierarchy to preserve the traditional values and appreciated the bishops as valuable allies in the fight for law and order and in opposition to anarchy. In 1923, O'Higgins was the keynote speaker at the annual conference of the Catholic Truth Society of Ireland. In his paper entitled The Catholic Layman in Public Life, he called on the Roman Catholic laity to be up and doing. This was to become a catchphrase, a clarion call to the myriad of militant Catholic societies, secret and open, to exert influence, overt and covert, to deliver on Catholic social doctrine. Thus, while a government minister, O'Higgins established himself as the leading figure in the emergence of militant Catholic action phenomenon. The objective of Catholic action was to influence and, if possible, to dominate social policy in the newly independent state. Instead of unemployment, poverty, and slum clearance taking centre stage, censorship of films and books, the outlawing of divorce and birth control became the focus of government policy. O'Higgins sponsored the intoxicating liquor bill of February 1927 to curb excessive drinking, which in his view was the biggest and most urgent social problem there was before the government. It is perhaps an irony that his greatest ally in this anti-alcohol drive was the Garda Commissioner Owen O'Duffy, whose fondness for alcohol would become legendary in the mid-1930s. In the year of Higgins' death, he prompted the Catholic Truth Society to publicly campaign for a bill sponsored by the Society for the Prevention of Evil Literature. He promised them that if he were still in office after the election, the bill would certainly be introduced. Such was O'Higgins' stature within Irish Roman Catholicism that 7 priests recited his Requiem Mass and 5 bishops were inside the altar rails. 300 priests marched in formation behind O'Higgins' coffin. O'Higgins' death was a major blow to the government, but not so to the Catholic hierarchy or his militant Catholic action comrades. Their influence continued to grow from strength to strength, and they saw the almost total adoption of the Catholic social agenda by successive governments over the following decades. The public reacted to the murder of O'Higgins with shock and sadness. The IRA denied any involvement and suggested that dissident elements in the Free State Army or even publicans angered by his curbs on the consumption of alcohol were to blame. Archbishop Bourne issued a pastoral denouncing the assassination as murder, stark and hideous. De Valera vehemently condemned the killing. The government responded by bringing in drastic new public safety measures involving the use of military courts and invoking the use of the death penalty. However, Cosgrave's next move played completely into De Valera's hands. He introduced an Electoral Amendment bill which obliged candidates to sign an affidavit that they would take their seats and the oath if elected. This was a huge help to De Valera for 2 reasons. First of all, it eliminated the Sinn Féin threat. He had left Sinn Féin. They would never sign the oath or sign such an affidavit, so they were out of the election. So his rivals were gone on that side. But more significantly, De Valera was able to tell his own party, if we don't take this oath and go into the Dáil, it will mean extinction for us as a party. So basically, the government played into De Valera's hands, and in August 1927, De Valera and his followers signed the oath and entered into the Dáil for the first time. The government won 2 by-elections shortly thereafter, probably on the strength of the public reaction to the murder of O'Higgins. Buoyed by this result, Cosgrave gambled on a general election. The gamble paid off, but only just. The government party increased its seats from 47 to 62 in September. However, De Valera increased the number of his TDs from 44 to 57 in the same period. Although De Valera would not gain power for another 5 years, everything seemed to be running in his favour. Professor Joe Lee suggests that although Cosgrave formed the government, he had retreated psychologically into opposition, as Fianna Fáil now stopped Cumann Gael and Hunter became hunted. Just when the tired old men of Cosgrave's cabinet thought things could not get worse for them, in 1929 came the Wall Street crash, which ushered in 5 years of recession and depression across the US and the Western world. Michael Malott suggests that even before the full rigours of the world recession was felt, a terrible economic malaise was apparent in Ireland. Although industrial employment had risen from 103,000 in 1926 to 111,000 in 1931, over 120,000 people had emigrated in the same period. The Wall Street crash reflected in an already depressed Ireland, with falling food prices further depressing the economy. The migration of Ireland's urban and rural poor to Britain and the USA stopped at this point because there was mass unemployment in the traditional labour markets of choice. In other words, with recession in America and recession in England, there was nowhere for the Irish urban and rural poor to emigrate to. In the meantime, the growth of Fianna Fáil had been exponential from the beginning. Within a year of its foundation, it had established 1,307 branches throughout the state. Whereas the IRA leadership regarded De Valera's recognition of Leinster House as treachery, the bulk of the rank and file were happy to cooperate closely with the new party. Tim Pat Coogan was perhaps overstating it when he suggests it was difficult to tell at what point a Fianna Fáil Cumann or branch became an IRA flying column at night. That's an exaggeration, but nonetheless, it makes a certain point about the closeness of the relationship. De Valera played the hand of a master politician by getting himself arrested in Northern Ireland for the breach of an exclusion order and by going on a high-profile trip to America. During his tour of the east coast of America, he told his adoring audiences that every Irishman longs for another Battle of Clontarf that will throw the English out of Ireland. Meanwhile, his able lieutenants, Sean Lamass and Jerry Boland, were building a political machine in every town and parish in the south. In September 1931, De Valera launched his national newspaper, the Irish Press, which was zealous in spreading the gospel of Fianna Fáil and gave an added impetus to the already considerable growth of the party. The IRA leadership were worried about hemorrhaging of its members to Fianna Fáil. They felt the need to show that the IRA was relevant at a time when Fianna Fáil was siphoning off their support base and their members. By the late 1930s, the leadership of the IRA, that is, were concerned at the enthusiasm of the rank and file for Fianna Fáil and the high-profile doings of De Valera. If the IRA were to retain its membership and attain any relevance with the public at large, it would need to carve out a political niche for itself. At this time, the most left-wing of the IRA leadership, you could say the only left-wing person in the IRA leadership, was Padre O'Donnell. He and IRA Chief of Staff Moss Toomey initiated a debate within the IRA, which led to the formation of Serra, a workers' and a small farmers' organisation. O'Donnell toured the country preparing IRA units for this public move to the left. At the General Army Convention in Glendalough held in 1931, the Serra programme was adopted. The IRA's goal was now to achieve an independent revolutionary leadership for the working class and working farmers towards the overthrow of British imperialism and its ally, Irish capitalism. Even before this new organisation was launched, the government was preparing a knockout blow that would see to it that Serra would be stillborn. Owen O'Duffy, the Garda Commissioner, had gradually built up a comprehensive and exaggerated report for government on the dangers of communism in Ireland. The report was based on documents seized from Sean MacBride and Sheila Humphreys, two well-known Republicans, and on anti-clerical and revolutionary articles published in Unpublic as the paper attempted to mould the IRA rank and file opinion in favour of a move to the left. O'Duffy's report suggested that the IRA was closely involved with communism, and this was a situation without parallel as a threat to the foundations of authority. It went on to claim that every effort was being made by O'Donnell and his associates to breed revolution and lawlessness and to encourage disrespect for and disobedience for its disrespect of and disobedience for authority. O'Duffy gave his report to Cosgrave, who used it as a basis for a memorandum addressed to Cardinal MacRory and 17 Roman Catholic bishops. Cosgrave pleaded with the Cardinal for his help, telling him, "We are confronted with a completely new situation. Doctrines have been taught and practiced which were never before countenanced amongst us, and I feel that the influence of the Church alone will be able to prevail in the struggle against them." The Garda Commissioner then brought this file from Bishop's Palace to Bishop's Palace, warning that these communists were about to take over the state. In fact, the total number of communists known to the police at the time was 73. O'Duffy and his distortions and exaggerations obviously impressed Cardinal MacRory. A few years later, MacRory recommended O'Duffy as the ideal person to lead an Irish brigade to fight for the fascist forces in Spain. MacRory described O'Duffy as a chivalrous, courageous, upright man, a good Catholic, and above all, a fine organiser. The first and only Serra Convention met in the Iona Hall in Dublin in late September 1931. There were approximately 120 delegates present, most of whom were IRA members, a few workers and working farmers. James Connolly's daughter, Nora Connolly O'Brien, and her brother, Rodney Connolly, were present. Sean Cronin tells us that most Dublin Republicans were delighted with Serra as it brought the movement down from its ivory tower and into the real world of political struggle. Nonetheless, the small numbers involved hardly suggest that a left-wing revolution was in the offing. Little did they know that the Church and State had concocted a plan for a drastic clampdown on this new initiative with a highly orchestrated and hysterical Red Scare campaign. State repression and clerical censure would be augmented by the whipping up of public hysteria through the national newspapers and the not inconsiderable Roman Catholic print media. 2 weeks after the Serra Convention, the government rushed through draconian legislation which banned Serra, the IRA, Cumann na mBan, and several little-known micro-leftist groups such as the Friends of Soviet Russia and the Irish Labour Defence League. A 5-member special military tribunal was established with the right to ban newspapers and impose the death penalty for certain crimes. All publications of papers, pamphlets, periodicals issued on behalf of prescribed organisations was banned. Michael Malott suggests that the objective of all this was that all organisations, no matter how small, which expressed views to the left of the Labour Party, were to be destroyed. Cosgrave made it clear that the coercion bill was a joint operation between the government and the Catholic Church, stating, "Nothing in this bill forbids the advocacy of political beliefs, but the advocacy in this state of communist doctrines cannot be tolerated. Church and state are the only bulwarks against anarchy, against chaos, sorry." There were no mass arrests, rather the government targeted the leadership of the IRA, most of whom went on the run. However, by the end of the year, there were 21 male Republicans in Arbour Hill prison and 3 females in Mountjoy. The only avowed communist organisation in Ireland at the time was the tiny Revolutionary Workers' Group. It escaped banning, strange to say, and its members, none of its members were arrested. The Revolutionary Workers' Group would even hold public meetings all over Dublin protesting the coercion. The largest rally was in College Green on the 18th of October, attended by thousands and addressed by young Jim Larkin as chairman and Sean Murray and Donny O'Reilly amongst the communist speakers. This rally was only possible because the government had made a mistake. They forgot to ban the Revolutionary Workers' Group. They banned it under a previous name it had, the Irish Workers' Group. So, in other words, the only avowed communist organisation in the state escaped banning. On the Sunday following the introduction of the coercion. In a clearly choreographed intervention, Cardinal MacRory and his bishops joined in the onslaught. A pastoral letter was read from every pulpit in every Catholic church in Ireland. Serra was described as a frankly communistic organisation trying to oppose upon the Catholic soil of Ireland the same sort of materialist regime with its fanatical hatred of God, which now dominates Russia and threatens to dominate Spain. The letter stated that you cannot be a Catholic and a communist. One stands for Christ, the other Antichrist. The Irish Catholic, the Catholic Bulletin, the Irish Monthly, the Irish Rosary, and the Irish Messenger all partook in a manic crusade fully supportive of government coercion against what the Bulletin described as the Soviet snakes in Ireland. The Irish Independent carried frenzied commentary with headlines such as Satan's terrible anti-God campaign and the communist gospel. One bishop called for vigilance committees to be formed in every parish to fight the Red Menace. A Catholic able-bodied men's association was established to fight against the Irish unemployed workers' movement. The church and state offensive took the IRA leaders by surprise and panicked its supporters. Many members broke from the organisation, fearing clerical censure. The IRA shelved Serra and withdrew from its socialist project. The government and its clerical allies must have been very pleased with how their joint campaign had played out. Yet the historian Brian Hanley suggests that the clampdown failed in its twin objectives, the destruction of the IRA and by implication, damning Fianna Fáil as red. If the main losers in this affair in the short term were the left-wing IRA members who supported Serra, in the long term, the Cosgrave government was another loser, and the two big winners were Fianna Fáil and the Catholic Church. In a general election called in February 1932, a general election was called in February 1932. The government called the election a little bit earlier than it needed to. They knew there was a Eucharistic Congress schedule, big Catholic festival schedule for June of that year, and they didn't want to have an unpleasant election campaign in the middle of the Eucharistic Congress, so they went for it in February instead of in June. The IRA leadership dumped its socialist rhetoric, but suspended its order from forbidding volunteers from working or voting in parliamentary elections. Instead, the volunteers were ordered to work for the removal of the Cumann Gael government. This meant that thousands of young, energetic IRA men worked tirelessly for Fianna Fáil. One individual who I knew, actually, a man called Paddy Brown, he was a bricklayer by trade. He was actually president of my union. But in 1931, he was a very young man. When he was a little bit older, in 1942, he was in one of De Valera's prisons. He was in the Curragh camp as a prisoner of De Valera. And he said at that time, he said, look at me now. He said, I'm in De Valera's prison. In 1932, I voted 46 times for Fianna Fáil. The government, the outgoing government, their election strategy was to claim that the gunmen and the communists were voting for Fianna Fáil. And this was perfectly true, but only because its Red Scare strategy had been so successful in seeing off the Serra project. However, there were many thousands of voters who were neither gunmen nor communists who voted to get rid of the Cosgrave government. Bauer Bell tells us that after the incredible Cumann Gael blunders of 1930-31, including the reduction of pensions, the reduction of police salaries, the reduction of teachers' pay, the prohibition on married women teachers, the party now stood on its record, which tells us had produced 100,000 unemployed, beggared the country, had driven the poor to desperation and the rich to fear revolution. Fianna Fáil won 72 seats to Cumann Gael's 57 and took power with the support of the Labour Party, and they would remain unassailable in power for the next 16 years. However, the Catholic hierarchy emerged from this battle with its already considerable power greatly enhanced. We have seen the control that they exercised through their death grip on education and through the thought moulding process, ensure they would always get the legislation and the legislators they required. Now, however, it became clear that anyone who would advocate any left of centre, liberal or anti-fascist policy, which the good bishops did not approve of, could be smeared as a red and expected to get what became colloquially known down in this part of the world as a belt of the crozier. The lordships could wield their croziers in the full knowledge that they had the full acquiescence of all the main political parties, the enthusiastic support and obedience to their instructions of the myriad of militant Catholic lay organisations, the half-dozen Catholic weekly newspapers, which had enormous aggregate circulation, gave pride of praise to all these warnings and denunciations by the bishops. The Irish Independent was always on hand to help their lordships with their red witch hunts. As the tiny Communist Party were about to discover, churchmen became dab hands at stoking mob violence and physical attacks on leftists. Violence that on at least two occasions led to buildings being burned to the ground. Throughout the 1930s, 40s and 50s, and even into the early 60s, anyone branded a red might be denounced by the local Catholic altar or character assassinated in the militant Catholic press. They might find a picket on their place of employment in order that they might be subject to dismissal by their employer. On one famous occasion, in 1933, Jim Gralton's dance hall was burned to the ground, and in spite of the fact that he was born in Ireland, he was deported to the United States. But that's a story, and perhaps a film, and perhaps a stage play for another day. Thank you very much for listening.
That was brilliant, Fergus. Thank you very much from all of us here. We do have a few questions for you now, if you'll stay and answer them.
Okay,
That's okay.
yeah, that's why I'm here, yeah.
Okay, so the first one is from Wayne. What if SF, which I assume is Sinn Féin, hadn't abstained from the FS Dáil? Would that have toned down Rome Rule, given the 37 Constitution recognising the status of the Catholic Church?
I doubt it. Any of the statements you see from the Sinn Féiners, they were very sort of Roman Catholic as well, and very determined that the whole question of Irish freedom was about Catholicism, and Ireland was so I don't think there was no sort of liberal side. In fact, I would say this: if you look at the statements of the Sinn Féin, it is they were more illiberal and more fanatical than either, well, certainly than Fianna Fáil, but probably as on a par with the Fine Gael people. So I don't think the Sinn Féin was a liberal body in any fashion, or an open-minded body. If anything, they were the most right-wing of the lot.
Thank you, Fergus. Liam Short is just wondering why the church were so against a political movement. One of his objectives were the eradication of private property.
I'm not sure what that question means, but like, the first thing to say is that the Catholic Church were quite slow in coming out to this anti-communism in the way they did in the early 30s, late 1920s, early 30s. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, the Catholic Church saw a great opportunity for itself in Russia, because the Bolsheviks had sort of fallen out with the ruling party, in other words, in Russia, had fallen out with the Russian Orthodox Party, and the Catholic Church saw a big opportunity for itself getting in there and making converts. And it was only sort of in the late 20s that the Pope came out fairly heavy against the Soviets and against communism. And to some extent, my own belief is that really the coming out government were using the church's anti-communism as a political stick to beat Fianna Fáil. And I think that's what all that all the denunciations about Serra and all was about that. Now, obviously, the church were only too happy to join in when they were asked, but I think the Coming Ale, Kevin O'Higgins and company were actually trying to use the Catholic Church for political purposes.
Thank you. Jim Quinn asks, were there alliances with Red Scare allies in the north beyond the Roman Catholic Church?
Well, in the north, the Reds and the left, the hard left, if you like, I don't like that term, but I can't think of it. The non-communist left, but so sort of the left under, they got as hard a time from the establishment in the north, which was very far from Catholic. So the anti-communism was one thing that the mainstream unionism and mainstream nationalism shared, and so the communists on the left tended to work both sides of the border. I mean, for instance, the nearest thing to a sort of left-wing socialist organization that existed in the 1930s was the Republican Congress that lasted for a couple of years in 1934 before it was smashed basically by Catholic Church-inspired violence. But the Congress actually did manage to put down roots in Protestant East Belfast, and in actual fact, on one famous occasion, there's depends on what newspaper reports you read, but on one occasion at Bodenstown, at the Wolftown commemoration in Bodenstown, one of the reports at least says that 500 Protestants from Belfast marched with a banner saying "Break the connection with capitalism." So the left succeeded for it, and some of that was built on the back of the outdoor relief strikes that had happened in the early 30s in the north of Ireland. So the left had attempted, with some success, to organise on both sides of the border, but their opposition came from both Catholic and Protestant establishments, depending on what side of the border they were operating on.
So did they kind of alliance with the workers' unions up in the north? In Belfast, there's half a dozen workers' unions up here.
What the Republican Congress did have some union contact in the north. I can't really remember which specific unions, but the Republican Congress in the north, in the south, the Republican Congress was a breakaway from the IRA. But in the north, there were people who would have been afterwards in the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and there was a party called the Socialists. I'm not sure if they were called the Northern Ireland Socialists, but there were quite a number of Belfast working class Protestants who classed themselves as socialists. They would have been at one point in the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and they would have at one point been in, I think it was called the Socialist Party of Northern Ireland or whatever. And they, for instance, had a joint newspaper at the time of the Spanish Civil War. There was a paper called the Irish Democrat, which was sold in both Belfast and Dublin. It was printed and written in Dublin, but it had both, basically, if you like, it had people who considered socialists, who considered themselves unionists, and socialists who considered themselves socialist Republicans. There was always a little bit of tension, even in the editorial board of the newspaper, because, for instance, if Frank Ryan, who was a left-wing Republican in the South, if he wrote a pro-Republican article, the Protestants in the North be saying, not only is that going to offend some of our members, you get us banned, the newspaper will be banned up here. So there used to be, Ryan was quite, he was frustrated because he was always asked to tone down the nationalism end of it, so that and stress the class politics, so that socialists on both sides of the border could identify with the newspaper.
Yeah, I'll just add there, Ryan that you're talking about was actually excluded from Northern Ireland when Northern Ireland was set up as its own private state. There was a list of about 30 people who were not allowed to come into Northern Ireland at the time.
Well, certainly there was a number. I don't know if that's true about Ryan. I never heard that. Well, there was a lot. See, for instance, remember I said during the course of the paper that De Valera was arrested in the north for an exclusion order. I mean, nearly all of the politicians, the well-known politicians, they were excluded from Northern Ireland, and you can see why. I mean, the authorities in Northern Ireland didn't want people going up there agitating against the treaty settlement and so on. So, so from time to time, very, very many Southern politicians and figures, not even people, politicians. And for instance, the Communist Party was finally set up in 1933. Before that, it was the Revolutionary Workers' Group. Sean Murray, the leader of the Communist Party, he was excluded from Northern Ireland for a very long time. But here's the thing, you know when all that changed? That changed when the Soviet Union was invaded by the Germans in 1941, and suddenly the Communists and the Soviet Union and the British were all on the one side against fascism. So, so Murray and the likes of him were welcome in the north of Ireland once again. And by the way, Murray was born in the north of Ireland. He was born in County Antrim.
Very good. Up here also, I think it was 1936. You have the foundation of the Italian fascists up north here in Belfast. I think there's about 30 members of it.
I think there's got a question, Sean, there in the chat there. No,
it's not a question now.
I think
you just me around the room.
Oh, sorry. No, I thought there was a question in the chat. What did come and engage Sinn Féin feel what they can do, if anything, to reach out to Protestant? Nothing is the short answer to that. You know, the question, sorry, okay, so I'm reading it, maybe people didn't hear it. What did they do to reach out to the Protestant community in the Free State? They did little or nothing. Now, most of the any the reaching out was on the Protestant side. Most of the people who had been unionists, who wanted to continue in politics, one of the things they did very, very quickly, once the treaty was signed and once partition became a reality, and the Southern Protestants started to regard themselves for the first time, obviously, in their lives as citizens of the Irish Free State. And if they wanted to be involved in politics, the bulk of them, and sit in the Dáil and so on, the bulk of them would have been members of Cumann Gael. That's what they would have found that their natural home. And a number of them, of course, would have been in the Senate. And I think one of the reasons the Ireland has this Senate, and one of the reasons the Senate was set up in the first place was to make a bit of space for the Southern Protestants to be involved in politics. So, for instance, one of the best-known Southern Protestants of them all, W.B.H. was a member of the Irish Senate, but there were a number of Protestant members of Fine Gael too. But that came about, if you like, because the Protestants themselves wanted to involve themselves in politics. There was nothing that I can see in the policies of any of the nationalist parties here that were specifically reaching out to Protestants. On the contrary, and for instance, quite often when the anti-communist rants would be going on, when the churchmen would be talking about communism, they often said communists and Freemasons, and sometimes when their guard was down, it would be communists, Freemasons, and Jews, you know. And to be honest with you, I think Freemason is a Catholic fanatical word for Protestant. Organized. In other words, the way the Catholics looked at it, all Protestants were Freemasons and weren't to be trusted. So you had Freemasons, you had communists, and then for the really more extreme people like O'Duffy and Paddy Belton and all, there was communists, Freemasons, and Jews were the enemy.
Thank you, Fergus. There's one here from Paddy. Given its history over the last 100 years, do you think the complete demise of the Irish Labour Party is inevitable in any new United Ireland which may emerge in the future?
The Irish Labour Party has always been very weak. Once or twice in recent history, it had a bit of a surge, and you know, when the other parties were on the back foot or whatever. I mean, the Spring Tide, I think, was a record. They got something like 30 seats that time. The Irish Labour Party was always, from the beginning, quite small. A lot of that had to do with, unlike Britain and unlike Northern Ireland, there wasn't a huge industrial workforce in Ireland. I mean, the vast majority of people who were working in the decade I'm talking about the 1920s. In that decade, there was an awful lot of agricultural labourers. There wasn't a lot of big industry. Most of the Labour Party seats would have been based on a big town like Limerick or Dublin or Waterford, where the Transport Union had a presence, and maybe union officials and that would become the Labour Party. But the Labour Party was never a serious contender for power in the whole history of this state. And I think, and by the way, also it was for most of its existence in the 20s and 30s. It was also quite right-wing, very, very cowed, very, very afraid to say anything that would offend the church or whatever. I mean, for instance, good case in point, just before we came on, we were talking about the Spanish Civil War. When the Spanish Civil War broke out, the Labour movement in England knew exactly what side it was on. It was on the side of the democratically elected government in Spain. But the Irish Labour Party were never prepared to go that far. They were always so worried that they might offend the Catholic bishops, that they always toned down their left-wing politics, and they never got involved in anything that they thought that the church might disapprove of.
Okay, Liam goes on to say, perhaps Labour shouldn't have given Sinn Féin a clear run in the 1918 election.
That's often said. They say that Labour, de Valera on one occasion said that Labour must wait, and that was a big mistake. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but there was definitely at the time of the War of Independence, there was definitely a situation where the message to Labour was to stay out of it and let Sinn Féin have a clear run. But even if they hadn't done that, I don't think the Labour Party was never, as I say, in a really very strong situation. And the other thing about the Labour Party at that period, they didn't really have a very good leadership. Connolly was dead. Larkin was either gone to America or gone mad, or possibly both. And William Partridge was dead. So there wasn't really, the Labour Party didn't really have, I don't think, a very strong leadership. And the people who were there weren't really that interested in socialism.
Dead on. Thank you, Fergus. There's a lot of very positive comments in the chat facility here, but I don't see any more questions as such. Can you? No, I don't see anything there.
We don't see anything now. So,
so maybe this be a good time to close up the meeting and say thank you very much, Fergus, for coming on to Trasnatera and Reclaim the Enlightenment tonight. That was very good of you to come on. Our next talk on Trasnatera is on Saturday with a man called Liam Mellows, and Reclaim the Enlightenment's next talk is next Monday, where we will hear a talk on how Britain wanted a Jewish Ulster in Palestine. So it's very kind of relevant to today and what's happening in the Middle East, I believe, anyway. So thank you very much, Fergus.
Okay, thank you. Bye now. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. Thank you very much. I'll just close it up.